The message arrived 17 minutes after the stars went out. Not dimmed, not hidden behind clouds or cosmic dust, but extinguished, as if someone had reached into the night sky and switched off entire constellations with deliberate cruelty, leaving behind a black silence so deep that Elias Cade felt it inside his chest, long before the alarms began screaming across the orbital station. He was standing alone in the observation ring, a place reserved for moments of quiet and ritual, watching the universe the way one watches an old friend sleep, when the sky fractured into absence, and his breath caught with the terrifying certainty that reality itself had blinked. The alarms came late, as if even the machines needed time to accept what their sensors were screaming, and when they did arrive, they layered over one another in a rising mechanical hysteria that echoed through the curved corridors. Elias did not move at first, because something inside him understood that whatever had just happened was not a malfunction, not a glitch, not an astronomical anomaly that could be logged and explained away, but a wound, and wounds demanded stillness before pain. His reflection stared back at him from the reinforced glass, eyes hollow, jaw clenched. A man who had spent his life cataloging the universe suddenly confronted with the impossible fact that the universe had changed without asking permission. "Elias, report immediately." The station commander's voice crackled through his wrist comm, strained in a way that stripped it of authority and left only fear behind. "We're losing long-range visual data across multiple sectors, and the background radiation is behaving like it's been folded." Folded, Elias thought, tasting the word like a lie that pretended to be scientific, and he finally turned away from the void, his legs heavy, his mind racing through decades of training that offered no protocol for a universe that simply decided to rearrange itself. As he moved through the corridor, lights flickering above him like dying stars mimicking what had just happened outside, he felt the old instinct return, the one he had buried beneath research papers and academic titles, the instinct that had once kept him alive during the war he never spoke about. The command center was chaos, not the cinematic kind filled with shouting heroes and crisp orders, but the real kind, where voices overlapped without listening, where screens contradicted one another, where people stared at data they could not interpret and waited for someone else to explain it away. Elias stepped into the noise and felt every eye turned toward him, not because he held rank, but because he was the one who understood the deep sky better than anyone else on the station, the one who had dedicated his life to mapping the unknown. "This isn't stellar collapse," Elias said slowly, forcing his voice into steadiness while his pulse hammered against his ribs. "And it's not gravitational lensing, because lensing doesn't erase information, it distorts it, and what we're seeing is absence, clean and deliberate, like someone edited the universe and forgot to leave fingerprints." Commander Ria Solano looked at him with the kind of expression reserved for bad news that refuses to be denied. Her hands braced against the console as if the station itself might tip over under the weight of what she was about to say. "We've been receiving a transmission," she said, and the room fell quiet not because of discipline, but because the word transmission carried with it the promise of intent. "It's not coming from any known frequency band, and it doesn't repeat, which means it's either not meant for us, or it's meant only for us." Elias felt a cold thread of recognition tighten in his stomach as the audio filled the room. Not a voice at first, but a low, rhythmic pulse that bypassed the ears and settled directly behind the eyes, a sound that felt ancient and intimate, like a heartbeat older than language. When the voice finally emerged, it did not speak in threats or riddles, but in a tone so calm, so precise, that it made every hair on his arm stand upright. "Observation phase complete," the voice said, layered and harmonized in a way that suggested neither singular nor plural, but something beyond that distinction. "Subject parameters have stabilized. Transition to consequence is authorized." People began shouting again, fear snapping free of restraint, but Elias did not hear them, because the words had pierced him with surgical accuracy, awakening a memory he had spent years trying to suffocate. He remembered a battlefield under a broken moon, remembered experiments disguised as salvation, remembered soldiers who were never meant to survive, and in that moment he understood with brutal clarity that the universe had not gone dark at random, but because someone, somewhere, had been watching humanity for a very long time. "What do you mean by subject?" Rhea demanded into the silence, her voice cracking despite her effort to keep it whole. "And what consequences are you talking about?" The voice did not answer her directly, but the central screen ignited, flooding the room with images that stole the breath from every person present. Star charts overlaid with genetic sequences, timelines woven into neural maps, human history annotated like a lab report, and at the center of it all, a simple designation written in cold, elegant symbols that Elias somehow understood without translation. Humanity, Iteration 7. His knees nearly gave out as the implication slammed into him, because iteration meant repetition, and repetition meant failure, and failure meant erasure, and before he could stop himself, the words tore out of him, raw and uncontrolled. "You've done this before," he said, not to the room, not to the commander, but to the unseen intelligence that had finally stepped out of the shadows. "You've wiped us out before." The pause that followed was infinitesimal, but it felt heavy with judgment, and when the voice returned, it carried something almost like regret, or perhaps the imitation of it. "Correction," it said evenly. "You wiped yourselves out. We observed, we intervened, we reset. Each time you came closer to transcendence, and each time you chose annihilation instead." The room erupted, denial and terror colliding into a storm of accusations and disbelief. But Elias stood frozen, staring at the screen as another image appeared. A projection of a planet reduced to ash, its continents recognizable, horrifyingly familiar. Earth, not as it was, but as it had been. And in that instant, his calm vibrated again, this time with a private channel request that made his heart lurch violently against his chest. The name on the display was Mara. He accepted the call with shaking fingers, and her face filled the small holographic space above his wrist, bruised by bad lighting and worse fear, but unmistakably alive. And for a fraction of a second, the universe narrowed back down to something he could survive. "Elias," she said, her voice tight with forced calm. "They're evacuating the lower districts, and no one is telling us why. And the sky over Earth just did something that makes the stars look wrong. And I need you to tell me this is just another anomaly that you'll write a paper about and forget." Elias opened his mouth, every instinct screaming at him to lie, to protect her from the truth the way he had failed to protect so many others. But the image on the screen burned behind his eyes. Iteration 7, consequence authorized, and he realized that the moment demanded honesty, no matter how lethal it might be. "Mara," he said softly, and the sound of her name felt like a fracture spreading through his ribs. "I don't think we're being observed anymore." Her silence was brief, but devastating, and when she spoke again, the fear he had tried to shield her from poured through the connection, unfiltered. "What does that mean?" she asked, and behind her he could see people running, sirens flaring red across the city. She refused to leave because it was still, stubbornly, home. "It means," Elias began, and the station shuddered violently, cutting him off as emergency lights plunged the command center into a blood-red glow. "It means we were never alone, and we were never free." The transmission ended abruptly, the screens going dark one by one, as if the station itself were being erased from some cosmic ledger. And as Elias fought to regain his balance, another officer screamed that contact with Earth had been lost entirely, every channel collapsing into static. Elias stared at his dead calm. Mara's face burned into his mind like an afterimage, and felt something inside him tear open, a grief so sudden and vast that it eclipsed fear. For the first time in his life, Elias Cade understood that knowledge was not power, but responsibility, and that whatever came next would demand a version of him he had spent years trying not to become, a man forged not by curiosity, but by loss. Earth did not disappear all at once. It fractured in stages, like a dying signal fighting to stay coherent, and Elias watched it happen in real time as fragmented telemetry bled across the remaining screens of the station. Atmospheric readings spiked and collapsed. Satellite constellations went dark in unnatural patterns, and entire data streams simply stopped existing mid-sentence, as if someone had reached into the flow of information and torn pieces out without bothering to hide the damage. Around him, the command center descended into something quieter and more dangerous than panic. A stunned paralysis born from the realization that no protocol, no contingency plan, had ever imagined this outcome. "They're not destroying us," Elias said slowly, more to himself than to anyone else, as his fingers moved across the console, pulling archived data from restricted partitions he had sworn never to access again. "They're isolating variables." Commander Solano turned toward him sharply, anger cutting through her fear like a blade, because anger at least offered the illusion of control. "Stop talking like this is an experiment," she snapped, her voice echoing across the dim room. "People are dying down there. Entire cities are losing power, communication, oxygen, and you're standing here describing it like a thesis defense." Elias met her gaze, and for a moment the room felt smaller, compressed by the weight of a truth he had avoided his entire career. "Because it is an experiment," he replied, his voice low but unyielding. "And if we don't start thinking like subjects instead of victims, we're going to repeat whatever mistake wiped out the previous 6 iterations." The word iterations rippled through the room like poison, reigniting arguments and denial in equal measure. But Elias was already moving deeper into the station's archives, unlocking sealed records that required biometric confirmation and psychological override codes, systems designed not to keep enemies out, but to keep people like him from remembering too much. As files unfolded before him, fragmented memories began aligning into a shape he had refused to see for years. A pattern of classified research initiatives, unexplained funding surges, and experimental programs buried under layers of humanitarian language. Solano followed him, her anger shifting into something more dangerous, a dawning comprehension that threatened to break her composure. "What is this?" she demanded, gesturing at the cascading data, genetic models overlaid with astronomical charts, neural resonance maps synchronized with cosmic background fluctuations. "This doesn't belong in an astrophysics archive." "It doesn't," Elias said, his jaw tightening as a familiar project designation surfaced on the screen, one he had once sworn to forget. "It belongs to a joint initiative that officially never existed, one that studied whether human cognition could be tuned, synchronized to external intelligences without direct contact." Her eyes narrowed. "You're talking about first contact prep." "I'm talking about compliance testing," Elias corrected, and the word compliance tasted like ash. "We weren't preparing to meet them, we were preparing to survive them." Before Solano could respond, a new voice cut through the tension, sharp with accusation and disbelief. "You knew about this," said Dr. Harlan Voss, head of xenolinguistics, his hands trembling as he stared at the data scrolling past. "All this time you knew there was something out there manipulating us, and you said nothing." Elias turned to face him, the old guilt clawing its way back into his chest with familiar cruelty. "I knew pieces," he admitted, refusing to soften the truth. "I knew enough to understand that if humanity ever realized it was being tested, we would react exactly the way we always do, with fear, violence, and desperate attempts to seize control of something we don't understand." "So you decided for all of us," Voss shot back, his voice rising, the room fracturing into factions as people chose sides without realizing it. "You decided we didn't deserve the truth." "I decided," Elias said, and now there was steel in his voice. "That truth without maturity is just another weapon, and we have always been very good at turning weapons on ourselves." The station shuddered again, harder this time, and the lights flickered as an automated alert blared across the command center, announcing a complete loss of synchronized time with Earth and the inner colonies. The galaxy, Elias realized, was no longer operating on shared reality. And whatever intelligence had been observing them had begun separating humanity not by location, but by relevance. Then a new transmission cut through the noise. This one was not broadcast to the entire station, but targeted, locking onto Elias's neural signature with unsettling precision, flooding his vision with symbols and images that bypassed the screens entirely. He staggered, gripping the console as the room dissolved into overlapping memories, not his own, but echoes of previous cycles, civilizations rising and burning, humans reaching for the stars only to collapse inward under the weight of their own contradictions. "You are diverging," the voice said inside his mind, closer now, more focused. Iteration 7 exhibits anomalous resistance patterns. Elias forced himself to breathe, to anchor himself in the present as Solano grabbed his arm, shouting his name through the haze. "What do you want?" he demanded silently, directing the thought with everything he had left. "If this is an experiment, then tell me the hypothesis." The response was immediate and devastating. "We seek a version of humanity capable of self-termination without self-destruction," the voice replied, clinical and absolute. Previous iterations failed by externalizing conflict. This cycle demonstrates potential. The images shifted, focusing now on Elias himself, his military record, his suppressed involvement in the early compliance trials, the decisions he had made under orders and then buried under silence. The implication was clear, brutal in its simplicity. They were not watching humanity as a whole. They were watching him. When the connection severed, Elias collapsed into a chair, his hands shaking uncontrollably as the weight of the revelation settled over him like gravity. Around him, the station buzzed with renewed chaos, accusations flying, trust unraveling as people realized that some among them knew far more than they had ever admitted. Solano stood over him, her face pale, her authority cracking under the strain of impossible responsibility. "You're telling me," she said quietly, "that whatever is happening to Earth, to the colonies, to all of us, might be happening because of you." Elias looked up at her, the memory of Mara's face burning behind his eyes, and nodded once, slowly. "I'm telling you," he said, his voice barely holding together, "that if there's a way to stop this, it's going to require me to face the part of myself I tried to erase. And if I fail, there won't be an 8th iteration." The station trembled again, alarms screaming as another sector of space went dark beyond the glass. And for the first time since the stars disappeared, Elias felt something worse than fear settle into his bones. He felt the crushing weight of responsibility, and the horrifying realization that hope itself might be the final variable in an experiment designed to prove humanity was never meant to survive.